matter of public service obligation funding and Blackpool Airport. Jesse Norman.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Mr. Gray. It's a delight to see you in the chair, and I'm delighted also to respond to the very good speech and useful interventions made by my colleagues, the member for Fylde and for Witney and for Blackpool South. Let me start by saying that I recognise, well, first of all, I should say I'm a man with a background, certain background, family background in general aviation. Many years ago, I got a PPL, and my uncle designed the Britten-Norman Islander, and I don't know if the Chamber recalls that moment in the James Bond film Spectre when the plane is flying along and gets its wings knocked off and goes skiing, but that is a Britten-Norman Islander designed by my uncle. So we have a certain amount of traction in this field and a certain sympathy for the issues raised by my honourable friend, the member for Fylde. Let me be clear, we recognise within the Department of Transport the importance of Blackpool Airport to the region, and we also recognise it as the centre of the Blackpool Airport Enterprise Zone, itself set up as a hub for business and medevac and flying schools and general aviation. And I note that this is the second debate we've had this year on this topic or related. That testifies. I thank very much the honourable member for Blackpool South for his earlier debate, to which I note the member for Witney was the minister in my chair responding, as he did very ably. And so there's a certain circularity here, but there's also a sense of energy and purpose that both of all of my colleagues, Fylde, Blackpool North, Blackpool South, and Cleveland, have brought to this issue, and rightly so. And let me thank them very much for what they have said. Now, as they have been at pains to emphasise, the UK enjoys what is in many ways a world-leading competitive commercial aviation sector, with airports and airlines operating and investing to attract passengers and to respond to demand. And of course, airports themselves have a key role to play as part of the sector. Where opportunities for growth exist, you can get local partnerships with the industry in order to develop the business case for new commercial flights. And my friend, the member for Fylde, rightly focused on the key goal being the commercial development and sustainability of the airport as part of the commercial development, sustainability, levelling up, union integration of the region. And he was right about that. And it is for airports, in the first instance, local authorities, local enterprise partnerships. Of course, I'll come on to some of the points that have been raised in the debate in the course of my remarks. Local businesses and other stakeholders to try to come together to build that case for commercial flights and to work with airline partners to create new connections for their communities. And it's airlines, of course, that will determine ultimately the routes that they operate based on their own assessment of commercial viability. It is very notable that, as the Honourable Fylde mentioned, Blackpool has a proud history of innovation in this area, as well as, historically, a thriving tourism industry which used the airport as recently as 15 or so, even less, years ago. So what we therefore need to do is to consider the question of the commercial development of the airport in the context of the wider processes of levelling up and regeneration. Now, as honourable colleagues will know, the air travel is provided principally by almost entirely by a competitive market. There's no bespoke funding or support from government for new routes, but there is support for domestic connectivity, and that's one of the things that the 50% reduction in domestic air passenger duty was designed to do. And of course, that was itself part of a package of air passenger duty reforms. There was a new reduced domestic band to support regional connectivity, but there was also a new ultra-long-haul band to align air passenger duty more closely with environmental objectives beginning from April of next year. Now, the question of a targeted APD is a very interesting question. I've no doubt, I speak as a former Treasury Minister in part, that the thought of a hypothecated or targeted APD will cause severe tremors, dare I say, nervous palpitations within the Treasury. But it isn't, for many understandable and obvious reasons. I mean, as Ernie Bevin once said in a different context, open that there Pandora's box, and who knows what Trojan horses won't come out of it. But I'm delighted to recognise my honourable friend, the member for Witney.
The point that he makes is a very good one. The 50% APD cut was very welcome. The point I'm making is what the department calls open PSOs, which is not a further Treasury subsidy, but simply removing APD on routes that are non-operational and the Treasury is getting no revenue or marginal. Therefore, there is a business growth opportunity there. It's that point I'm asking him, essentially him to push with the Treasury. I appreciate it's not in his gift.
That's very helpful for him to clarify that. He certainly raised both. There is a way of thinking of open PSOs that isn't just tied to APD, but let me come to the question of PSOs in general slightly further on in my remarks. We have some support for domestic connectivity through domestic APD, and of course, we are continuing, and I'll touch on this in relation to the Union Connectivity Review, to explore alternative routes as to whether there may be other ways to address this. In the context of PSOs, if I may very slightly lay a different emphasis from my friend the member for Fylde, it's important to recognise that the PSO policy, as it presently is set up, is designed to support not new flights. That's the question that's being raised by the honourable member for Witney, but routes that have previously been operated commercially or are now at, as it were, present risk of being lost. So the question of new routes is somewhat different, and the routes that are funded at the moment, as he will know, at least across the UK, are modest. There are 3 public service obligations. There's the one from Londonderry to Stansted, Newquay to London Gatwick, and Dundee to London City. But there are also an additional 17 PSOs which connect the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, wholly within the borders of Scotland, and the administration of funding of these, by agreement with DfT, is the responsibility of the Scottish Government. So we operate within a context of existing policy, and within that policy, it is important, and this goes to the point about the stance of the local authority, which was raised by colleagues. It's important to say that my officials have received no requests so far to discuss the need for any PSO routes for Blackpool Airport from the local authority. So, I mean, I leave that to local colleagues to decide how they want to interpret that. But, of course, if there was going to be PSO support, it would have to be a matter initiated and agreed with the local authority. And the fact that we have heard nothing from them is, I don't think, is essentially helpful to the cause that they're promoting. But it is important to realise that, that PSOs are, as I say, in the context of where there are commercial services at risk of being lost, or which has recently, that is, generally speaking, within the last 2 years, been lost. And therefore, in that sense, the loss that my friend the Honourable Fylde mentions goes outside that remit and therefore doesn't fit within the existing policy. If and when it does, and this would undoubtedly be in part of the same process for any consideration of new routes at some point in the future, I'll come on to that shortly, it would be through a business case, warmly and widely agreed locally, in which the local authority would have to play, I think, a leading role. And I think that's a very important aspect. And honourable friends will be aware that levelling up really only works effectively when everyone is lined up in the same way: business, local authority, local members of parliament, other key stakeholders. And when they are so lined up, it can be enormously effective and successful. Now, just to remind us all, the routes should be ones in which historically there are no viable alternative modes of travel, and the route is deemed and demonstrated to be vital to the social and economic development of the region. It's also important to say that if and when such a grant is made of a PSO under the current policy, there then requires to be a procurement exercise to find an airline. That needs in turn to be a full and open tender for selection. And the subsidy provided is based on the airline's operating losses on that route, which they submit as part of a tender bid. So it's a very context-dependent decision, and of course those things would then be independently assessed in terms of any new approach would have to decide how, where there had not been a prior existing commercial flight, a non-distortive method of subsidy and support could be provided. So let me just pick up a couple of points relating to the Union Connectivity Review, which were raised by colleagues, and rightly so. The Chamber will recall that in November 2021, Sir Peter Hendy published this independent review designed to explore how improvements to transport connectivity between Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and England could boost not just economic growth, but also access to opportunity and everyday connection, social integration. And it certainly did identify the key importance of airports and air connectivity, both providing connectivity into London, but also providing connectivity in and between peripheral regions, which I think gets to the points that were raised by colleagues. Now, we are considering our response, as you might imagine. My colleague, Baroness Veer, leads for this in the other house on the issue of aviation, in relation to aviation. But it's a departmental-wide response to the Union Connectivity Review because it's a multimodal strategic review in nature. And as part of that, we are going to explore, and we are exploring, what further opportunities there may be to utilise PSOs in order to support regional connectivity in the levelling up agenda. My officials have already been actively considering how airport slots are allocated in the UK, and now that the UK has left the EU, there is scope for an opportunity for the government to legislate changes to improve the slots system to ensure that it provides connectivity that UK passengers need. And that, of course, has knock-on effects on economic growth around, or maybe expected to have economic growth, knock-on effects around the country. Let me say a couple of final things about levelling up. The Chamber will know that regional airports play a potentially very important and actual role in levelling up. It is important to recognise that that's not just about the foundation of the wider UK aviation sector, it's also about the business opportunities that can be directly generated as a result of the supply chains and the other enterprise engagement that's involved with those. The Chamber will recall that the government has published a strategy for the future of aviation, so-called Flight Path to the Future, which sets out a vision for the sector over the next 10 years. And that includes not just some of the discussions that we've had about connectivity, but also economic workforce and skills and innovation and decarbonisation. And we will expect, naturally, a low-carbon approach to the regeneration of any new airports, for all the reasons my honourable friend, the member for Fylde, has mentioned. I think that's a potential source of advantage if it's properly handled. It is our goal that UK domestic flights should reach net zero by 2040, and airport operations, a very important potential ancillary contributor to carbon emissions, should be zero emission by 2040. We are providing significant amounts of support for that, not just in the area of sustainable aviation fuels, but also the commercialisation of those plants and other R&D co-investment, and in particular through ATI. And, of course, alongside that, the levelling up agenda and Jet Zero and Net Zero together provide the context within which there can be a diversification, a deepening, a broadening, and a very significant boost to the activity conducted in and around airports. I want to give my colleague a moment to respond, and so let me... In that case, I don't need to do that, but which is even a privilege that I won't abuse in any case by speaking further, but I thank him very much for the comments he's made. I thank my honourable friends for the interventions they've made and for the previous interest that they've shown in this area.
The question is, this House consider